Hello folks, we are starting on our last unit of the term, hematology. Hematology is the study of blood. So in this lecture we will simply discuss general characteristics of blood, talk about plasma and white blood cells. Your reading is chapter 17. Everybody knows how blood looks and perhaps even how unpleasant it tastes. It has a metallic taste to it. The color varies depending on the level of oxygenation. It's bright red, scarlet color when it's oxygen rich and relatively darker red when it's depleted of oxygen. The average volume of blood is about 5 liters. It greatly depends on the general size of the body, and since guys are usually bigger, have a little bit more blood. The temperature of the blood is a little higher than the temperature of the body, so it's about 38 degrees in centigrades. And another very important characteristic that you absolutely have to know is the pH of blood. Remember, pH measures the level of acidity. For blood, it is between 7.35 and 7.45. Recall that pH scale is a logarithmic scale, and 7 is a neutral point, whereas anything below is acidic and anything above is alkaline or basic. So obviously blood is slightly alkaline. The pH of the blood is extremely important and needs to be maintained within this range. We have multiple buffer systems that allow us to maintain the pH at these levels. Also, kidneys as well as lungs participate at regulating the pH of the blood. Perhaps you were too young to remember, but maybe you read that book later. Michael Crichton wrote a book, Andromeda Strain, that deals with the satellite bringing back to Earth some microorganism that affects the pH of the blood, and people die very quickly because pH is disturbed. And then we made a movie, Andromeda Strain, in '71, and another one in 2008. It's a really, really good book, and the first movie really follows very closely, but please keep in mind that the whole plot rotates around the pH of blood. With that little detour, let's come back to our discussion of the blood. What is it for? Well, it's a major transport medium. It distributes different substances. It plays a regulatory role as well as protective roles. So what does it transport? Well, even a kid would tell you it transports oxygen to the tissues and carbon dioxide to the lungs. It also transports nutrients from the digestive tract and liver to multiple tissues. But it also removes waste products. Wastes in general are eliminated via 4 major ways. Very small amounts can be excreted with sweat. Lungs get rid of anything that's in a gas form. Kidneys eliminate water-soluble waste. And liver helps us convert hydrophobic substances into hydrophilic substances and then excretes them with the bile. Additionally, blood transports hormones from endocrine glands to target cells. Of course, you know everything about that since we already have covered the endocrine system. Blood maintains the body temperature. Heat is produced actually during the muscle contraction, and that heat can be distributed depending on the needs. For example, when you're really cold, you are trying to conserve heat, and what happens is your skin vessels go in a constricted state. Very little blood goes through the skin. The heat exchange between the body and the surrounding environment decreases. You keep more heat. On the other hand, if you're hot, vessels in the skin dilate, more blood passing through, more heat is exchanged between the blood and surrounding tissues and therefore the atmosphere, so you're losing heat, effectively cooling yourself down. Of course, this mechanism only works as long as the environment temperature is lower than the temperature of the body. We already talked about the maintaining normal pH, and multiple buffer systems work here. We will talk about the regulation of pH in the third term after we cover kidneys and lungs. Finally, it's very important for us to maintain normal fluid volume so that the circulatory system can work appropriately, and the blood plays a role here as well. Protection. What is it protecting us from? You're immediately thinking of microorganisms, whether that's bacteria or viruses. That's definitely true. It protects us by producing antibodies, by producing special defensive proteins, complement proteins, and white blood cells themselves play an important role against foreign invaders. Additionally, blood protects us from a fluid loss. So we look at the fluids in the body altogether as two different compartments: intracellular, or inside of the cells, and extracellular compartments, which include plasma of the blood as well as extracellular fluid. And of course, fluid loss, usually associated with a blood loss, is something that needs to be prevented, and clotting mechanism plays an important role in this. Blood, recall, is also a tissue, and it belongs to a connective tissue category. Connective tissues are known for not only having cells, but also a large amount of extracellular material, and that is plasma. Plasma is about 55% of the volume of the blood. Blood cells are red blood cells or erythrocytes, white blood cells or leukocytes, and platelets or thrombocytes compose the remaining 45%. In fact, if we draw blood and let it sit in a test tube, or to speed up this process, we can centrifuge the blood, it will separate into 3 layers. Red blood cells are the heaviest, and they will accumulate in the bottom. They will be about 45% of the blood volume. Then there'll be a small, what we call a buffy coat, that contains other formed elements like platelets and white blood cells. Finally, the 55% or about so is plasma. I mentioned on several occasions that red blood cells are about 45% by volume of the blood, and that measurement is known as hematocrit. Hematocrit varies a little bit between men and women. In men it's a little higher, it's about 47 plus minus 5%, whereas in females it's about 42 plus minus 5%. But who cares? Why should you worry about hematocrit? Because it's a quick way to evaluate if there are enough red blood cells in the blood, and therefore whether the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is adequate. So I do want you to know the normal value at about 45%, because that's an average for both genders, and it's an important number to remember. Now let's talk about the plasma. As I mentioned, it is the extracellular matrix, and it is fluidy, and that's why blood belongs to the fluidy type of connective tissues. Of course, it's fluid because it predominantly consists of water. Over 90% of plasma is water. Naturally, all of the substances found in it gotta be water soluble or have special accommodations to increase their solubility. What else is there? Everything else that's dissolved in it is called solute, where water is a solvent. If you are not familiar with those terms, think about putting some sugar in your coffee. Your sugar would be a solute, and your coffee would be a solvent. Make sense? So water is a solvent, and there are substances in it are the solutes. We have plasma proteins, about 7%, organic and inorganic solutes at 1% each. So let's talk a little bit about plasma proteins. Majority of plasma proteins are made in the liver, and there are 4 major categories. They are albumin. Albumin is the protein that is a non-specific carrier for many hydrophobic substances, but its most important role is actually osmotic pressure. About 60% of plasma proteins is albumin. Clotting proteins, especially fibrinogen, also play an important role and also found in relatively large concentration, about 4%. And needless to say that the function of clotting proteins is to form blood clots. Alpha and beta globulins both are the specific carriers. For example, remember back in the first term when we talked about different type of hormones, we said thyroid hormone is hydrophobic and requires a carrier. We have a special carrier for thyroid hormone. Well, that's one of those globulins. Make sense? So that's about 36% of the plasma proteins. And the last category here is gamma globulins. That's the only group that is not manufactured by liver. It's made by blood cells themselves. Gamma globulins are also known as antibodies, and they are synthesized to protect us against